In the spring of 1940, the Japanese Naval Air Service faced a crisis that no amount of imperial decree could solve. Their current fighter, the Nakajima A4N, was obsolete. Allied pilots had begun calling it a relic. The Americans were laughing, openly, in debriefings and mess halls across Southeast Asia. They had every reason to. It was then that a directive arrived from the Navy Ministry. Design something faster, something that could outrun the enemy. The specifications were brutal. The aircraft had to be lighter than anything previously conceived. It had to climb faster. It had to turn with impossible precision, and it had to be built within 18 months. Jiro Horikoshi, chief aircraft designer at Mitsubishi, read the requirements in the engineering office in Nagoya, surrounded by drafting tables and the faint smell of ink and cigarette smoke. He was 36 years old, thin-framed, with eyes that seemed to calculate distances in the air as he spoke. His team called him methodical. His superiors called him reliable. But what they were asking for seemed to defy the laws of physics. "They want a fighter that weighs less than 2 tons, whispered Takeo Doi, his lead engineer, tapping the specifications against the desk. "That's impossible. The engine alone." "Then we strip everything else away," Horikoshi replied quietly. He had already begun sketching on paper, his pencil moving with mechanical precision. What emerged from those first weeks was radical. A design so minimal that when foreign observers first saw the prototype photographs, they didn't believe it was a combat aircraft. The fuselage was thin, almost skeletal. The wings were long and elegant, like the limbs of a dancer rather than a weapon. There were no heavy armor plating, no redundant systems, no margins for error. Every rivet was calculated, every millimeter was sacrificed to one singular purpose: to dominate the air through maneuverability and grace rather than brute force. The nickname came first from the skeptics. Japan's slowest fighter, they called it, the A6M Raisen, the Zero. The press in Western capitals mocked it. How could such a fragile machine survive combat? How could it possibly match the power of American engines, the ruggedness of British design, the engineering confidence of Germany? Horikoshi never responded to the mockery. He was too busy in the wind tunnels, watching smoke trails curl around the prototype's wings, adjusting control surfaces, eliminating drag. His team worked through the night. The factory floor at Nagoya became a cathedral of precision, each worker understanding that a single mistake could collapse months of effort. By the autumn of 1940, the first operational Zero took to the skies above China. Pilot Saburo Sakai gripped the stick, felt the aircraft respond like an extension of his body, and knew immediately that something had changed. The machine was alive in a way others were not. It didn't fight the pilot, it anticipated his intentions. Within weeks, reports began to arrive at Allied intelligence stations throughout Asia. American pilots in China were seeing something unprecedented. Japanese fighters were appearing at altitudes where they shouldn't exist. They were turning inside every Western aircraft in the region. They were climbing at angles that seemed impossible. And they were doing it with a grace that military efficiency never suggested. The laughter stopped abruptly. By the end of 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the Zero had already become a legend in whispered conversations across Asian airfields. It was no longer the slowest fighter, it was the most lethal. It was the aircraft that had shattered the assumptions of every air force in the world. The machine that proved that speed and armor were not the only measures of combat superiority. Horikoshi received word of the attack on his radio, standing in his office as the winter light dimmed outside. He said nothing. His team had created something extraordinary. Whether that creation would bring salvation or ruin, he could not yet know. The war had begun, and with it, the true test of the Zero's design, not in the wind tunnel or in test flights, but in the merciless calculation of actual combat. The files would later show that Horikoshi wept that evening alone in his office, not from pride, from understanding. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts travel and at what moments of the day or night they reach you. The Pacific War became the proving ground. From December 1941 through the middle of 1942, the Zero achieved something no other aircraft had accomplished: near-total air superiority over an entire theater of combat. Across the vast expanse of ocean and island, from Wake Island to the Philippines, from the Coral Sea to Midway, Japanese pilots climbed into the cockpit of Horikoshi's creation and found themselves again and again operating at a level of advantage that seemed almost unfair. Pilot after pilot reported the same phenomenon. The moment the Zero appeared in the sky, the calculus of survival changed. American pilots, many of them fresh from training and flying heavier, more powerful aircraft, found themselves outmaneuvered in ways they could not have anticipated. The Zero climbed higher. It turned tighter. It could accelerate out of a dive and into a climb with a responsiveness that defied the sluggish handling of Curtiss P-40s and early model Wildcats. By March 1942, intelligence reports flowing into Washington and London began to reflect a troubling reality. Japan had not simply designed a new fighter. They had designed a fighter that was rewriting the rules of aerial combat. Horikoshi was not present to see this triumph. He was in hospitals and laboratories, suffering from tuberculosis contracted during the years of intense work. His body was breaking down at precisely the moment his creation was ascending. It was a cruel symmetry that would have seemed scripted had it not been entirely true. From his bed, through letters smuggled by colleagues, he learned of the victories. He learned that pilots were calling the Zero untouchable. He learned that Allied air forces were frantically redesigning their tactics, their aircraft, their strategies. All of this had emerged from his pencil, from his calculations, from his willingness to challenge the orthodoxy of what a fighter aircraft should be. But Horikoshi understood something that the military reports could not capture. The Zero's supremacy was built on a bargain with physics, and physics always collects its debts. The aircraft had no armor. The pilot sat in a cockpit that would not protect him from a rifle bullet fired from the ground. There was no self-sealing fuel tank. A bullet through the wing meant fire, meant death. The airframe was constructed from materials that were increasingly difficult to source as the war progressed. The manufacturing process required a level of craftsmanship and precision that became harder to maintain as experienced workers were conscripted or killed. More critically, the Zero's design advantages, its lightweight, its agility, its climb rate, came from engineering choices that created vulnerabilities. It could not dive as steeply as heavier fighters without structural failure. It could not absorb damage and continue flying. Every advantage carried a counterweight, a hidden cost written into the mathematics of its construction. By mid-1942, American pilots began to understand this calculus. They learned to fight the Zero differently. They learned not to turn with it, but to use their superior diving speed and armor to strike from above and behind. They learned that a Zero, damaged, was a Zero that would not return. They began to develop tactics that exploited the very qualities that made it superior. At the same time, Japanese aircraft production was beginning to fragment. The resource demands of the war, the increasing effectiveness of American submarine campaigns against Japanese shipping, the damage to industrial facilities, all of these were creating bottlenecks in the supply of materials. The Zero required aluminum of specific composition, radial engines that were increasingly difficult to manufacture, precision machining that required stable working conditions and experienced technicians. Horikoshi, recovering slowly from his illness, received reports of these developments through his network of colleagues still working in the industry. He understood what was happening. The aircraft that had been built to dominate was now locked into an arms race it could not win. The Americans, with their vast industrial capacity and their ability to learn and adapt, were beginning to catch up. By late 1942, new American fighters, the Hellcat, the Corsair, were arriving in the Pacific. They were heavier, more powerful, better protected. They were not as agile as the Zero, but they were resilient in ways the Zero could never be, and they represented the beginning of the end. Horikoshi understood this before most others. He saw the trajectory clearly in the data. The Zero had owned the sky for a brief, brilliant moment, perhaps a year and a half of near-total superiority. That moment was passing. The war would continue for years. But the age of the Zero's dominion was already ending, even as pilots continued to fly it to impossible victories. In his journals, recovered after the war, he wrote, "The aircraft was perfect for a war that would last 6 months. We built it for a conflict we could not sustain." The turning point came in August 1942, not in a great battle, but in a series of small encounters that collectively shifted the perception of what was possible. American pilots flying the new Hellcat and Corsair fighters began to hold their own against the Zero. More than that, they began to win. The mechanics of this shift were subtle but profound. American pilots were learning that if you could avoid the turning fight, if you could maintain altitude and speed, if you could strike and disengage, rather than dogfighting in the traditional sense, the Zero's advantages diminished. The aircraft that had seemed invincible was revealed to be, in fact, a machine built for a specific kind of war. The kind of war where numbers were small and skill determined everything. But the larger war was not small. It was industrial, mechanized, mathematical. It was about production rates and replacement pilots and the ability to sustain losses and continue fighting. The Zero had been built by a culture that understood elegance in engineering, but had misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare. Horikoshi returned to work in late 1942, still weakened by illness but determined to continue. The military was demanding improvements to the Zero. They wanted it faster, wanted it to climb higher, wanted it to defend against the new American fighters. But the aircraft was already at the edge of what its design could achieve. Adding weight, armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, more powerful engines, would destroy the very characteristics that had made it superior. He faced an impossible choice. Modify the Zero into something heavier, more robust, less agile, losing its identity in an attempt to adapt, or defend the original design philosophy, knowing that it was increasingly unsuited to a war that had evolved beyond it. The decision was made for him by circumstances. The military demanded upgrades. The factories began producing modified versions, the 052, the 053, each iteration adding weight and complexity, each modification eroding the elegant simplicity that Horikoshi had designed into the original. By 1943, the Zero was already becoming obsolete in the eyes of experienced pilots and strategists. It was still dangerous. A skilled Zero pilot could still achieve victories. But the era of dominance had definitively ended. American production had ramped up. American pilots were being trained in tactics specifically designed to counter the Zero. American aircraft were becoming more numerous and more capable with each passing month. Intelligence reports reaching Japanese headquarters painted a stark picture. The Zero, which had represented Japanese technological superiority and the promise of victory, was now a symbol of a war that was being lost, not through any fault of design, but through the collision of engineering elegance with industrial reality. Horikoshi received the reports in silence. He understood what they meant. The aircraft had been perfect for a moment. That moment had passed. The war would continue, but the Zero would no longer define it. In his private writings from this period, recovered from his personal files decades after the war, he recorded an observation that would resonate through the decades. "We designed an aircraft for gods, but the war required machines that could be maintained by ordinary men, built in factories that could sustain continuous production, and piloted by soldiers who could be replaced. We created something beautiful, but beauty does not win wars. Only persistence does." If this story surprised you, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. By 1944, the Zero had become a relic on a battlefield that had evolved beyond recognition. The aircraft that had achieved 437 confirmed kills and had dominated skies from Burma to the Gilbert Islands was now being hunted like prey. American Hellcats, with their superior speed and firepower, were destroying Zeros at a ratio that had become embarrassingly one-sided. The root cause was not a failure of design, but a failure of resources and strategy. Japan could no longer replace its losses. Every Zero shot down represented both an aircraft and a pilot, often an experienced pilot who had survived years of combat. American production was replacing both. New Hellcats rolled off assembly lines by the hundreds, and new pilots arrived from American flight schools with months of training behind them. Horikoshi watched this decline from his laboratory and design offices, increasingly frail, suffering recurrent bouts of tuberculosis that left him bedridden for weeks at a time. He had designed something extraordinary, but it had been built on assumptions about the war that had proven catastrophically wrong. The military now demanded something different, a fighter that could climb higher, fly faster, and engage the new American fighters at higher altitudes. The result was the Ki-84, a fighter that represented a partial abandonment of Horikoshi's Zero philosophy in favor of a design that tried to match American aircraft more directly through speed and power rather than through agility and grace. Ironically, the Ki-84 was a better fighter in many ways, but it was also too late. The Zeros that continued to fly were increasingly piloted by inexperienced pilots, young men with weeks of training facing American pilots with years of combat experience. The equation had inverted completely. The aircraft no longer mattered as much as the pilot, and Japan had lost the capacity to produce experienced pilots. Reports from the field became progressively more grim. Zeros were being shot down at an alarming rate. By mid-1944, entire squadrons of Zeros were being withdrawn from service because there were not enough experienced pilots to fly them effectively. The aircraft that had once represented the cutting edge of Japanese air power was becoming a death trap for the unprepared pilots assigned to it. Horikoshi, now visibly declining in health, received visitors from the military who wanted to know what else could be designed, what new miracle of engineering could turn the tide of the war. He told them the truth. No aircraft could compensate for the loss of trained pilots. No design could overcome the industrial and strategic superiority of the United States. The war, from a technical standpoint, was already lost. The military officials did not want to hear this. They wanted designs, specifications, promises of improvement. Horikoshi provided what was requested: drawings for new aircraft, suggestions for modifications to existing designs. But he knew, with the certainty of a man who understood the mathematics of war, that nothing would change the outcome. In letters to colleagues dated late 1944, now preserved in Japanese military archives, he wrote about the Zero with a tone of profound melancholy. "We gave them an aircraft that could fly at the edge of physics, but we could not give them victory. The fault was not in the aircraft. The fault was in the strategy, in the resources, in the refusal to accept that industrial capacity and sustained production would determine this war, not elegance of design." The final Zeros were manufactured in 1945 as Japan's industrial capacity collapsed under sustained American bombing. The aircraft that had been born from pencil sketches and wind tunnel calculations in the relative peace of 1940 was dying in a nation consumed by fire and defeat. The war ended in September 1945. Jiro Horikoshi did not live to see the post-war reconstruction of Japan. He died in January 1982 at the age of 78, having lived through the occupation, the rebuilding, and the transformation of his nation into an industrial powerhouse through peaceful means. But in the final decades of his life, he rarely spoke about the Zero. When he did, it was with a tone of melancholic reflection rather than pride. He understood what his creation had meant, a moment of superiority in a war that could not be won through superiority alone. A beautiful machine that had flown into a future it could not control. The Zero survives today in museums and in documentary footage. Historians regard it as one of the finest aircraft designs of its era. Pilots who flew it, those who survived, spoke of it with reverence. But Horikoshi understood something that all the historical accolades could not change. The Zero had been a perfect aircraft for a war that lasted 1 year. After that, it was merely a machine, increasingly vulnerable, piloted by increasingly desperate men in a conflict that had become about industrial capacity and strategic defeat, not about the elegance of engineering. In his memoirs, published posthumously, Horikoshi reflected on his life's work with words that have echoed through decades of aviation history. "I designed an aircraft that could outmaneuver anything in the sky, but I could not design one that could save Japan. I created a machine that was perfect in its moment." That moment passed, and the war continued without it. The lesson I learned, too late to matter, was that perfection in engineering cannot compensate for imperfection in strategy. The Zero represents a paradox of warfare, a triumph of design and ingenuity that could not alter the fundamental mathematics of total war. It was an aircraft born from the assumption that quality could overcome quantity, that elegance could outlast industrial production, that a perfect machine could win a war fought on a scale that demanded mediocre machines produced in endless succession. The Pacific War proved otherwise. Thousands of Zeros were built. Hundreds of Allied aircraft were destroyed by them. Thousands of Allied pilots were killed, yet none of it changed the trajectory of the conflict. The war was decided not in dogfights between exceptional aircraft and skilled pilots, but in factories and shipyards, in oil fields and logistical lines, in the capacity of one industrial nation to sustain losses that another could not. Horikoshi had given Japan an aircraft that achieved dominance, but he could not give them victory. No engineer could have. The files remained sealed for decades after the war. The design specifications, the test data, the reports of pilots who had flown the aircraft, all of it was classified by both American and Japanese authorities, fragments of a history that could not be fully told until decades had passed. When the documents were finally released, historians could trace the arc of the Zero's evolution from triumph to irrelevance with the precision of its own engineering. The aircraft that had laughed at by the Western powers had dominated the sky. And then it had been forgotten by a war that had grown too large, too industrial, too absolute for the perfection of a single machine to matter. The Zero endures in memory. But the war moved beyond it, and in that gap between perfection and necessity lies a truth about warfare itself, that elegance is not strategy, and that the finest engineering cannot solve the problems posed by total industrial conflict. The aero engines are silent now. The factories are museums or ruins. The pilots are gone. And the Zero remains, a monument to what engineering could achieve, and a testament to what it could not. Subscribe to our channel to explore more cases and curiosities from World War II. Thank you for following the story. See you in the next video.